Welcome to another special episode of our Mandatory Mental Liberation series, produced by Baba Jelani Bomani Dembe, founder of Majestic Mind Matters University. I'm your royal narrator, Queen Magical Melanin, for this new episode titled, From Protest to Policy, Unpacking the George Floyd Policing Act. The necessity of the Mandatory Mental Liberation series at Majestic Mind Matters University lies in our focus on serving our melanin-rich culture communities. By addressing the importance of knowledge of self to produce greater self-awareness and advocating for our mental liberation, but especially for our precious melanin-rich culture children, our messages aims to combat the enduring effects of generational mental enslavement stemming from the historical trauma of the chattel enslavement of the ancestors. Our initiative seeks to empower us to break free from these harmful and unfavorable legacies and cultivate a deep-rooted sense of self-identity and unwavering resilience. In this episode, if the term Black, African American, marginalized people or people of color is used in reference to our melanin-rich people, it is for the sole purpose of expressing the importance of understanding the mindset of global society for that time period in history, compared to our well-informed melanin-rich culture mindsets today. Our melanin-rich culture people who are reading more extensively and our melanin-rich culture people that stay on the go and who actively listen and subscribe and share podcast links, just like these produced by Baba Jelani Bomani Dembe, the founder of Majestic Mind Matters University in the Mandatory Mental Liberation series messages. With me, Queen Magical Melanin, your royal narrator, for our open-minded melanin-rich culture people who are seeking more understanding and greater knowledge of self for true uplifting spiritual empowerment. The murder of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, sparked a nationwide reckoning with issues of systemic racism, police brutality, and social injustice in America. In response to this tragic event and the many others like it that have taken place throughout the country, lawmakers at the local, state, and federal levels have taken significant steps to address police reform and racial justice issues. One of the most prominent legislative actions taken in response to George Floyd's murder is the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. This federal legislation, introduced in Congress, aims to increase accountability for law enforcement agents' misconduct, enhance transparency in policing, and improve law enforcement agents' training and practices to address systemic racism and bias in law enforcement agencies. The goal of this act is to hold law enforcement agents accountable for their actions, prevent future incidents of law enforcement agents' brutality, and promote racial justice and equality in law enforcement agencies. In addition to the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, there have been other legislative measures introduced at both the federal and state levels to address law enforcement agents' reform and racial justice issues. The BREATHE Act, for example, calls for divesting federal resources from incarceration and policing and investing in new approaches to melanin-rich culture community safety and well-being. This bill seeks to address the root causes of crime and violence, rather than relying on punitive measures that disproportionately impact our melanin-rich culture communities. Similarly, state-specific legislation such as the Breonna Taylor Act in Kentucky aims to ban no-knock warrants and increase law enforcement agents' accountability in response to the murder of Breonna Taylor, another victim of law enforcement agents' violence. These state-level reforms are crucial in addressing the unique challenges and issues faced by our melanin-rich culture communities at the local level. Furthermore, various law enforcement accountability acts have been introduced in states and cities across the country to hold law enforcement agents accountable for misconduct. These measures include requirements for body cameras, bans on chokeholds, and measures to promote law enforcement agents' transparency and accountability. By implementing these reforms, lawmakers hope to rebuild trust between law enforcement agents and the melanin-rich culture communities they serve and address the systemic issues that have led to incidents of law enforcement agents' violence and brutality. In addition to these specific legislative measures, there have been broader efforts to strengthen civil rights laws and enforcement mechanisms to protect us from law enforcement agents' violence and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or other factors. These efforts seek to ensure that we as well, are treated fairly and equitably by law enforcement agents and the criminal justice system, regardless of our background or identity. Overall, the legislative actions taken in response to George Floyd's murder represent a significant step towards addressing the systemic issues of racism, law enforcement agents' brutality, and social injustice that have plagued America for far too long. By enacting comprehensive reforms at the local, state, and federal levels, lawmakers are seemingly working to create a more just and equitable society where we are treated with dignity and respect. While there is still much work to be done, these legislative measures represent an important first step towards creating a more inclusive and fair criminal justice system for us as well. The tragic murder of George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement agents in May 2020 sparked a nationwide reckoning with systemic racism, law enforcement brutality, and the need for reform within the criminal justice system. In addition to legislative actions, such as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, several other initiatives and reforms have been enacted in response to George Floyd's murder. These initiatives aim to address the root causes of law enforcement agents' violence, rebuild trust between law enforcement agents and melanin-rich culture communities, and promote accountability and transparency in law enforcement agency practices. One significant area of reform following George Floyd's murder has been the revision of use-of-force policies in law enforcement agencies across America. Many departments have implemented changes to emphasize de-escalation tactics, limit the use of lethal force, and prioritize the preservation of our lives. These reforms are crucial in ensuring that law enforcement agents are held accountable for their actions and that unnecessary violence is minimized in interactions with the public. In addition to revising use-of-force policies, there has been increased support for community law enforcement agency programs that focus on building trust and relationships between law enforcement agents and the melanin-rich culture communities they serve. These programs emphasize engagement, dialogue, and collaboration between law enforcement agents and our melanin-rich culture community members, with the goal of fostering mutual respect and understanding. By supporting melanin-rich culture community law enforcement initiatives, policymakers are working to address the underlying issues that contribute to distrust and tension between law enforcement agents and our melanin-rich culture communities. Another important reform initiative that has gained traction in the wake of George Floyd's murder is the implementation of implicit bias training for law enforcement agents. These training programs aim to address and mitigate unconscious biases, racial profiling, and discriminatory practices in law enforcement agencies. By raising awareness of these issues and providing law enforcement agents with better tools to recognize and counteract their biases, implicit bias training can help to improve the fairness and effectiveness of law enforcement agents' practices. Furthermore, the establishment of independent oversight boards or review panels has been a key reform strategy to increase accountability and transparency in cases of alleged law enforcement agents' misconduct and use of force. These oversight bodies provide an external mechanism for investigating complaints against law enforcement agents, ensuring that cases are reviewed impartially and that appropriate disciplinary actions are taken when misconduct is substantiated. Independent oversight boards play a crucial role in restoring public trust in the accountability of law enforcement agencies. Additionally, law enforcement agency reform task forces have been formed at the local, state, and federal levels to study law enforcement agents' practices, recommend reforms, and monitor progress in implementing changes to improve law enforcement agents' encounters and the outcomes. These task forces bring together experts, community leaders, and law enforcement agency officials to identify best practices and develop strategies for addressing systemic issues within law enforcement agencies. By engaging in collaborative efforts to reform law enforcement agents' practices, policymakers are working towards creating a more just and equitable system that serves us as well. Other initiatives that have been implemented in response to George Floyd's murder include the development of mental health crisis response programs within law enforcement agencies, training programs to promote equity and inclusion among law enforcement agents, and efforts to address racial disparities in law enforcement agents' activities while in the field. These multifaceted approaches to reform aim to address the complex and interconnected issues that contribute to law enforcement agents' violence and racial injustice. By enacting these initiatives, policymakers and white communities are taking important steps towards creating a more equitable and accountable system of law enforcement that respects our rights and our dignity as well. The tragic murder of George Floyd has sparked a movement for change and accountability in law enforcement agencies that has reverberated across America. In response to widespread protests and demands for justice, policymakers, advocates, and white communities have come together to push for legislative actions and reforms aimed at addressing systemic issues in law enforcement agencies and promoting social justice. While much attention has been focused on law enforcement agents' reform measures, such as banning chokeholds and establishing independent oversight bodies, there are a number of additional initiatives and measures that have been implemented to further advance these goals. One key area of focus has been on data collection and reporting requirements for law enforcement agencies. By mandating the tracking and analysis of use of force incidents, law enforcement agents' misconduct, and demographic information, policymakers aim to uncover patterns of bias and discrimination within law enforcement agencies. This information can then be used to hold law enforcement agents and law enforcement agencies accountable and drive reforms to eradicate systemic racism within law enforcement agencies' practices. In addition to data collection, the establishment of civilian review boards has been put forward as a critical mechanism for increasing transparency and accountability in law enforcement agencies. These independent oversight bodies provide a means for civilians to review complaints against law enforcement agents and monitor law enforcement agencies' departmental policies and practices, ensuring that law enforcement agencies and their agents are held to the highest standards of conduct and professionalism. Furthermore, there have been calls for the enactment of laws that explicitly ban racial profiling and other discriminatory practices by law enforcement agents. By implementing clear prohibitions and penalties for violations, policymakers seek to root out bias and discrimination from law enforcement agents' practices and rebuild trust between law enforcement agents and our melanin-rich culture communities they serve. Another critical area of focus has been on strengthening training and certification standards for law enforcement agents. By requiring ongoing education on topics such as de-escalation, implicit bias, cultural competency, and community relations, policymakers aim to equip law enforcement agents with better tools and knowledge they need to serve our melanin-rich culture communities effectively and more respectfully. Moreover, the promotion of restorative justice programs as an alternative to traditional punitive measures has gained traction in the wake of George Floyd's murder. These programs focus on repairing harm, addressing root causes of conflict, and promoting healing and reconciliation, offering a more holistic approach to justice that prioritizes melanin-rich culture community well-being and rehabilitation over punishment. Calls to reallocate funding from law enforcement agencies' budgets to invest in community-based programs and services have also been growing louder. By redirecting resources towards education, healthcare, affordable housing, and mental health support, policymakers aim to address the underlying social and economic disparities that contribute to crime and violence in our melanin-rich culture communities. Legal reform has also been a key focus of efforts to promote social justice and equity. Advocates have been pushing for changes at all levels of government to address systemic inequities, reform sentencing laws, eliminate mandatory minimums, and promote alternatives to incarceration that prioritize rehabilitation and reintegration. Lastly, initiatives to enhance community engagement, empower our melanin-rich culture populations, and amplify the voices of those most impacted by law enforcement agents' practices have been gaining momentum. By involving communities in decision-making processes and promoting community-led solutions, policymakers aim to build trust and foster collaboration between law enforcement agents and the melanin-rich culture communities they serve. In conclusion, the range of reforms and initiatives put forth in response to George Floyd's murder reflect a holistic and multifaceted approach to addressing the systemic issues in law enforcement agents' activities in our melanin-rich culture communities and promoting social justice. By tackling issues such as data collection, civilian oversight, racial profiling, training standards, restorative justice, community reinvestment, legal reform, and melanin-rich culture community empowerment, policymakers, advocates, and communities are working together to create a more just, equitable, and accountable system of morally just law enforcement for us as well, that respectfully upholds our rights and dignity. I'm your royal narrator, Queen Magical Melanin. We trust that you have expanded your understanding through the insights shared by Baba Jelani Bomani Dembe, founder of Majestic Mind Matters University, in our mandatory mental liberation series message titled, From Protest to Policy, Unpacking the George Floyd Policing Act. Remember this, it is essential to honor the ancestors. We have a unique connection to the ancestors. They endured many unwarranted struggles, preserved our melanin-rich culture, and passed down invaluable wisdom through many generations. By honoring the ancestors, we pay honorable tribute to our roots and draw great strength and much-needed inspiration from the unwavering resilience and royal legacy that has paved the way for our present and future generations. Ancestral reverence is a powerful way for us to continually uphold our own melanin-rich identity, heritage, and cultural legacy. Here is an ancient Alkebulan proverb to keep in mind. If you think you are too small to make a difference, you have not spent the night with a mosquito. Remember this as well, whenever you are in the presence of anyone, saying, they don't see color, it actually means they don't see you. As a member of our melanin-rich culture, you must strive for knowledge of self for greater personal awareness. Always treat yourself kindly and seek to live a totally awesome and gloriously fulfilling melanin-rich culture life. So, like, subscribe, and share this very special melanin-rich culture link with everyone that you care about and that really cares about you and all of yours as well, and thank you for listening. Ashe.